I've overseen over 1,000 real estate transactions, and if you're a real estate agent working with a buyer and you finally wrote an offer and it got accepted, what do you do now? That's what today's video is all about. The roadmap from the time you have an accepted offer up until closing date. How do you ensure a smooth transaction? What are the different things you need to be aware of? What are the different steps you need to be taking now that you're under contract? That's what today's video is all about. So if you find this information helpful, subscribe to the channel and let's jump in as far as what you do now that you have an accepted contract. So now that you're under contract, what's one of the first things that you need to do? Well, I would say this is probably one of the most important because it establishes the timeline for everything from here on out. Do you actually have an accepted and bound contract? Have all the sellers signed? Have all the buyers signed? And was it marked accept on the contract? You'd be surprised, but I see a lot of contracts come through that they forgot to even check accepts and everybody signed the contract. So make sure you have a fully bound agreement. These are legal documents of very large proportion, $500,000 homes, $1 million homes. You don't want to be negligent as a real estate agent. So make sure that it is bound because the time it was bound, your binding agreement date, is going to establish your timelines for everything in the contract. This is day 0. So in Tennessee, the binding agreement date is going to be once all parties have signed off on this accepted contract and everybody has a copy. And then everybody has a copy can be the agents themselves. It doesn't mean the seller actually has to have the copy because they've hired a representative for them. Kind of think like attorneys. We're not attorneys, but as soon as your agents receive notice here in Tennessee, it's deemed that you've also received notice. So that is the binding agreement date. Everybody signed, everybody has a copy. Now you can start calculating all your deadlines because you know this is day 0. We have an accepted contract. The next thing I want you to do, and this is talking relatively quickly as soon as you've received that accepted contract. I'm not saying wait a couple of days because time is of the essence with these legal documents. What I want you to do next is get with your client and both of you in both of your calendars. Mark all your deadlines that are in that contract. When you wrote that offer, you set different deadlines for your client. So how long for the inspection period? How long to deliver earnest money deposit? When's the closing date? And as a real estate agent, you should be on top of these deadlines. Never let anything lapse. Don't let the closing date lapse. Let's say the lender needs a couple more days and you just let it lapse and close in a couple of days. Don't do that. You could be negligent. Don't let anything go past the deadline. So this is why I want you to mark everything in your calendar and also have the client do it as well. So that way they are aware of these deadlines because defaulting on a legal contract can lead to a lot of legal consequences and we want to avoid that. So this is a very simple task. Once you've marked everything in your calendar, the next thing I want you to do is send a copy of this contract to all the interested parties. So I'm talking title companies, maybe closing attorney if you don't have title companies, the lender, do you have a transaction coordinator? Send all the documentation that they would need to all those parties. They don't know that a deal has happened until you've actually sent them notice with all the contracts. I've seen several agents that they thought the title company automatically gets their contracts or they didn't know the lender needed it right away. All these parties are working on individual tasks to get this deal done for both parties. Title company has to start searching for the title, make sure it's clear. The lender has to start submitting everything to underwriting and working to get the money in order. So it's very important. Immediately, as soon as you can, send all the proper paperwork to all the interested parties, even your transaction coordinator. They don't know that your deal has been accepted unless you let them know. And to wrap up the first couple hours of being under contract, the last thing I want you to do after you've noted what day 0 is of the contract, you've written in your calendar all the deadlines, you sent a copy of the contract to everybody that would need it, the last thing I want you to do is to talk with your client and have a heart-to-heart. I want you to set expectations. Let them know that title companies, lenders, they work usually Monday through Friday, typically 9 to 5. You need to establish boundaries with your client because if you don't, they're going to be calling you at 11 p.m. They're going to be calling you all weekend. So establish boundaries with your clients and set that expectation. Hey, I know this is an exciting time. There's a lot of information. There's a lot to get done and it can be kind of nerve-wracking. However, we need to know that a lot of these parties work typically Monday through Friday. And when you set that expectation and create boundaries for not only these other providers, but also yourself, you're going to sleep a lot easier at night because you finally set that expectation. All right, so now let's start getting into some of the actual steps that we need to take as a real estate agent. We're past the first couple hours of being under contract. What do we need to start looking for now? Well, what I've already done as far as with my client, having them mark all the deadlines in their calendar and my calendar and setting expectations, What I'm going to do for them as well is send them an email with all those deadlines. That way it recaps and it's written notice that they're aware of. Yes, they've signed off on this contract and they created all the terms in their offer, but we want to just continuously communicate really well with them. But one of the first deadlines that's probably going to approach for most clients and you as the buyer's agent is going to be the earnest money deposit. Now, this money is good faith money that is oftentimes going to be credited either towards their down payment or their closing costs. Now, if you are a really good real estate agent and your client helps you out, and let's say they want to back out of the deal and you're within a contingency deadline and you do it before the deadline expires, they can typically get that money back. So this earnest money deposit, a lot of times it's going to have to be due within the first 3 days, 5 days, or 7 days of being under contract. Look in your contract for when this is exactly due. Now, how do you make earnest money deposit? This is going to be having your client contact who is actually the holder of the earnest money. Typically, it's going to be your closing attorney or your title companies. So call them. Sometimes I get questions from agents as far as how to make earnest money deposit. Hey, call that title company and ask them. It's very important when you're under contract to start relying on these different vendor professionals for those specific questions. Any title company questions? Ask the title company. Any lender specific questions or mortgage questions? Ask the lender. Your broker comes into play for any legal help, contract questions. That's when you contact the broker. Now, your earnest money deposit typically is going to be wired or a cashier's check. But again, call the title company and ask. And your client should communicate directly with the title company. You can find out instructions, but let's say your client wants to wire the money to the title company. As a real estate agent, never touch wiring instructions. So if a title company sends it to you via email, do not forward it to your client. That's how I've seen emails get hacked, and you don't want to do that. So if your client says, hey, I'm just going to wire the money to the title company, okay, that's awesome. Call the title company directly and set that up. That way you stay out of it as a real estate agent. But that's the first things, probably one of the first deadlines that you're going to have in your contract is the earnest money deposit. The other thing we want to be doing while we are trying to coordinate the earnest money deposit is have the client schedule the home inspector. Now, again, I recommend for real estate agents, you can know very good home inspectors, but I would have the client pick out who they want to use and have the client order the inspector. Because again, you just never know. Hopefully your home inspector should be licensed and insured, but let's say they mess up, well, who referred them? And if it was you, you don't want to stick your neck out and be on the hook for that. So have your client schedule a home inspector. Now, a good tip here is know your deadlines, going back to one of the very first tips. So let's say your inspection is for 7 days. You have the first 7 days of being under contract to have all your inspections, maybe ask for repairs, terminate, or decide if you're moving forward. Well, you don't want your client to schedule the inspection for day 6 of being under contract. That's too rushed. You're not going to make it. And the seller has no legal obligation to offer you an extension on your inspection period. So be very aware of this. Have that inspector scheduled probably the first day or 2 of being under contract. The third most common type of deadline that's probably in most contracts, because a lot of buyers need a mortgage to buy a property, is going to be working with the lender and scheduling that appraisal. That's kind of your big 3, your earnest money deposit, your inspection deadline, and ordering that appraisal. Now in Tennessee, again, the contract says within the first 14 days of being under contract, the buyer has to pay for and order the appraisal, and they have to secure homeowners insurance. So it's very important, again, know your contract and know your deadlines. But the lender, most of the times, almost all the time, if the client is getting a mortgage, the lender is going to be the one that orders that appraisal. So you need to get with them to see when they're scheduling that. A scheduling tip is to wait until after your inspection period has passed until the appraiser comes out and does the appraisal. Now, why is this? Because you want to make sure that the house is fully sound and make sure that you negotiate any repairs during that inspection period. And if the buyer terminates, then that way they're only out the cost of the inspection, not the inspection plus the appraisal. So separate the two. Fully get through the inspection period, then have the appraiser come out. Because an appraisal report can be $500-$600. So make sure to coordinate that and make sure your buyer is contacting the lender and constantly communicating with them. It's very typical that while you're under the transaction and under contract, the lender is probably going to constantly be requesting different documents from the buyer. So they need to be contacting and working directly with that buyer hand in hand and set that expectation for your client. Hey, the lender may be asking for different things throughout this transaction. Please get them to the lender in a very timely manner. That way they don't need any extensions for the closing date. Now with the inspection and the appraisal, this is where you come in as a real estate agent. you are to follow the client's lawful orders. So if they want different things repaired, negotiated, if the appraisal comes in low, this is where you are going to negotiate with the listing agent, and this is where you come in. So again, make sure you have all the proper paperwork, any amendments, repair amendments, make sure you're very clear with those, and make sure anytime that more documentation is created, any amendments that are fully signed, any closing date extensions, that again, those initial parties, maybe your transaction coordinator, title company, lender, make sure they keep getting documents that are created while you're under contract, because they are left in the dark and they don't know what's going on unless you communicate with them. All right, now let's say that everything has gone well. The home, we've gotten through inspections, maybe we negotiated a couple repairs, the home appraised just fine. Now what do we do? Well, we are probably approaching the closing date. What you want to do is work with your buyer on a couple different items. One of them being scheduling the closing date and time. And I'm going to go over different tips later on in this video as far as what times are best to schedule a closing. But you also want to schedule a final walkthrough or a final inspection. Now, why do you want to do this? Because this is the client's chance to confirm that nothing has changed about the condition of the property, to make sure it's in the same or better condition, and to make sure that any additional items that were negotiated to stay with the property are still there. I've seen where maybe washers and dryers that were supposed to stay have disappeared, or refrigerators have disappeared, or something, maybe the above ground pool is broken. So this is your time to schedule a final walkthrough and go through the home with your client. Now, one of the most important things with this final inspection is to, one, always get seller approval for everything. Scheduling your inspection, ask for approval. Don't just say, hey, our inspection day is this day and time. Always get it approved. It's not your house. Same thing with the final walkthrough. Ask for a time, get it approved, and wait for it to be approved. Don't just show up to the house without an unapproved appointment. But when you're there at the final walkthrough, make sure the client is thoroughly checking everything with the home, different appliances, lights, make sure the garage door opens. So check for all these different things and bring with you as a real estate agent a final walkthrough form. This form is one of the biggest CYA forms. If your client signs this, oftentimes it'll note, we confirm the property is in the same condition or better than when we first went under contract. And if they sign this, that is a huge protection against you as the real estate agent. You should always have this form included. And if I was a listing agent and I was selling a property, I would actually ask the buyer's agent to send me a copy of the final inspection walkthrough. And if they're refusing to do that, I would probably, as a listing agent, send that form to the buyer's title company. So there's a lot of ways to get this signed, but be on top of it. This is one of the most important forms that you can get signed. A couple of the other items that you're addressing a couple days before closing, even a couple weeks before closing, is going to be starting to transfer different items into the buyer's name. So one of those things is going to be utilities. So get with the listing agent and ask them, hey, how long is the seller going to have the utilities in their name? Oftentimes the utilities should be kept on through the final inspection period and oftentimes through the closing date. But contact the listing agent first to see when the seller plans to shut off everything. You don't want your buyer to be without electricity, water, maybe there's gas on the property. Make sure the client is going to get maybe Wi-Fi or internet. So have them set up all these things on the correct date, and you can coordinate that with the listing agent. Another thing with the listing agent is to coordinate when they want to pick up their sign and lockbox. So I've seen where sometimes listing agents forget about these items, and it could be a week or two beyond closing, and those items still remain. So get with the listing agent, see when they're going to pick those up, and ask them how keys and any garage door openers can be exchanged. A lot of times as a listing agent, I would drop those off at the buyer's title company. That way when they sign and the deal is funded, the title company can just hand it to the buyer. So you can also ask for any warranty information, maybe different manuals, like could be your hot water heater, a new refrigerator, a new dishwasher. So there's all these different things that if the seller leaves can actually benefit the buyer. So just ask if the listing agent can ask the seller to provide any of that information. Another thing the buyer wants to be aware of is, besides utilities, their movers and scheduling that. We do not want movers to show up before the buyers have closed on the property. They can only take possession according to the contract. And oftentimes that's after they signed and funded the deal. So make sure the buyer is aware of that and they schedule buyers accordingly. And one of the last items the buyer wants to be aware of and you need to coordinate with them and tell them to do is wire their proceeds to the title company. So they could probably have their down payment and maybe even some closing costs that they still need to fund. Well, tell them to go ahead and wire that money several days before closing. And again, don't touch wire instructions, but have the buyer client contact title directly and coordinate that. But that way, if the money is sitting there at the title company, when they sign, there's no hiccups or delays when this deal funds. Now, when you're looking to schedule a closing date and time, you want to get with your client and see when they're available, because they're oftentimes working or have other things planned, and they're going to have to clear out probably a good 2 hours, if not more, in order to close on the property. Especially with a mortgage, there is a lot of documents, and if the buyer wants to read over those, it could take a while. So prep them that this could take a couple hours. But what I always recommend is to schedule something and talk with your client first, but schedule a closing time that is in the morning of that date. I want to close as early as possible. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it provides a buffer. That way, in case the seller hasn't moved out yet, maybe they haven't finished fixing some of the repair items, that we have a buffer that we could move the closing to later in the day. The other reason that I want my buyer clients to close early in the morning is because funding could be an issue if you close in the afternoon. A lot of times, wires that go out in the afternoon are not going to hit the other side until the morning. So in Tennessee, it's oftentimes a split closing state. That means that the seller is going to close with one title company and the buyer is going to close with a different title company. Well, if the buyer signs in the afternoon and then that buyer's title company has to wire the money to the seller's title company, and then the seller's title company has to wire that money to the seller, they're probably not going to get that money until the very next day. And some sellers and listing agents can be sticklers about it and say, you're not going to get the keys until the money's in my account. Therefore, I want my buyer to sign as early in the day as possible. That way money has plenty of time to go over to the other title company or even hit the seller's account, and funding does not delay anything. But if you are closing in the afternoon, sometimes it's unavoidable. Prep your client, prep your buyer client that, hey, funding could happen the very next day. Work with the listing agent to see if it's still okay that the buyer takes possession. And of course, always refer to your contract as far as when is possession legally given. Now, one of the last items to address is going to be your commission check. So you've worked so hard, you've spent so many hours on this deal, it's time to get paid. Well, not yet. And hear me out on this. So a lot of traditional brokerages, when you have a closing, that entire commission check is going to be sent off to the brokerage. Now, they could give you the check and then you drive it to the brokerage, depending on your brokerage policies, or the title company might have to mail that check to your brokerage. So just be aware that you might not get paid instantly. There's some agents that every single day are like, can I get paid? Can I get paid? Can I get paid? So just be aware of your brokerage policies, because let's say, for example, a title company has to mail that to your brokerage, then the brokerage has to actually receive it, deposit it. They might have to wait for it to clear their bank. Could be a day or two, depending on the size of the amount. Then they are going to send you your money. So this could take several days, if not weeks. And I've seen that at other brokerages. Now, luckily with us, our agents get paid instantly. So we have a special form, a CDA, that as long as the broker has signed it, our agent can receive their amount of the commission directly from the title company when they're dispersing. So that's one of the awesome things with us. But this is just things to be aware of with your brokerage. Now get with them to see their different policies. So to recap the entire process of being a buyer's agent, it comes down to really two different things. One, knowing your contract in and out and all the deadlines. And two, communicating very well with all parties. This will establish and set the tone for how this transaction goes. If you know all your deadlines and you stick within them and let nothing lapse, you are going to be really well off. And if you communicate really well with all parties constantly, I've given you a lot of steps as a buyer's agent. These could be weekly emails sent out to your client as far as next steps, what to expect, and updates about the transaction. So if you constantly do these two things and focus on it and everything else in this video, you're going to be a very good buyer's agent, and they're going to refer you more clients. So if you found this video helpful, subscribe to the channel, really helps us out. Let me know anything else that you think I missed or that you would like to see in future videos, and I'll see you next time.